Thank you so much, Miloš. Thank you to the organizers for the very kind invitation to be here today. I really want to thank Michael, Andreas, and Konstantina for their determination, their perseverance in making this conference happen. I have to say it's been a really great experience so far this morning. You are aiding in my rehabilitation from 2 years in the pandemic. You've gotten me out of the Netherlands. You've brought me to a glorious city in Vienna. I arrived a little bit earlier yesterday, deliberately, so that I could explore. I spent a wonderful afternoon in the Kunsthistorische Museum, where I got to look at many, many beautiful things. Now, I had to somewhat engage in an exercise of cognitive dissonance, because I didn't want to think too much about how these beautiful things had made their way into this museum. I just wanted to enjoy the fact that I was immersing myself in beauty and creativity. And what I want to talk to you about today is about quite the opposite. It's about the destruction of beautiful things. It's about crimes against culture, crimes against cultural heritage. And those of us who have been engaged in international criminal law these past years will know that it is something of a hot topic. This morning, Michael referred to the recently published policy paper on cultural heritage, one of the final acts of the outgoing prosecutor, Fatou Bensouda. It's a policy paper that had been in the making for many years and which followed through on her commitment to make the prosecution of crimes against cultural heritage one of the pillars of the OTP's prosecution strategies. Michael also referred to some of the landmark cases in this regard, mentioning the Al-Mahdi case, the first prosecution of an individual based solely on charges relating to destruction of cultural heritage. It's become a go-to source of sort of success for the ICC, principally, I think, because stories of success at the ICC have been somewhat limited thus far. But in engaging in this topic in recent years, I was drawn to it because I wanted to understand many aspects of it, the nature of the harm that derived from crimes against cultural heritage. And this led me, when I was first invited to present at this conference, to propose this title, Culture, Rights and Crimes, the Legacy and Potential of International Criminal Law. It's deliberately vague. And when I actually get into the meat of my presentation, you will realize that I'm not really going to talk about this topic, because over the course of the pandemic, I became more and more interested, not in the general scope of this particular topic, but is everything okay? Sorry, someone's waving at the back.
No, I just wonder how far you will go away from the topic. So because I try to prepare questions for you, but I'm looking very forward.
All will
if the
be
questions
revealed.
fit your presentation now. So
I can assure you my abstract is reflective of what I'm going to talk about. Where was I? So yes, what I want to talk about today is to go back and look actually not at the contemporary developments or forward looking, but to look at the origins of accountability for crimes against cultural heritage in the history of international criminal law. I want to go back before the Nuremberg judgment and talk about what was done in this respect by the UN War Crimes Commission, the UNWCC. There's been an awful lot of research in recent years, principally by scholars like Kirsten van Lingen, Dan Plesch, who have got access to the recently opened archive of the UNWCC. There's been a lot of interesting scholarship exposing how the UNWCC dealt with crimes relating to torture, rape and sexual violence, etc., etc. So one of the first sort of complementarity-based organs of international criminal justice were finally getting a sense of what it was doing to assist in the domestic prosecution of international crimes. What this scholarship has not dealt with has been the degree to which the UNWCC was engaged with cases relating to the destruction of cultural heritage, of cultural property. So I want to talk about that. I've gone through the archives and I've revealed an interesting, I think, narrative story of exactly what was happening. Now, I should mention that my archival research is ongoing. My conclusions are non-existent at the moment. It's a work in progress, but I wanted to share it with you nonetheless. Now, I could start by engaging in a sort of an outline of the nature and extent of the destruction of cultural property, the looting of cultural property in the context of the Second World War. But the dynamics of Nazi crimes against cultural heritage is extremely complex and not something that I can unravel in a single paper. But to give you a sense of it, I'll start by one quote from an author, Jonathan Petropoulos, which has stood out to me, and it's from his book, The Faustian Bargain, The Art World in Nazi Germany. And he points out that only tyrannies understand the true power of art. And when you try to understand the scale of Nazi crimes against art and heritage more generally, the poignancy of this statement really shines through. Crimes against culture and the eradication of the other were central pillars of Nazi ideology. It went to the very foundations of National Socialist ideology and genocidal intent. The nature of the program was complex. It was led mostly by one individual in the form of Alfred Rosenberg, who we're all familiar with as one of the defendants at the main Nuremberg trial. He was obsessed with what he referred to as degenerate art, a warped notion which railed against modernism or any art or artist that was not compatible with Aryan principles. So so-called degenerate art was looted from private and public collections, or was either sold, typically to foreign buyers at well below market prices, or it was destroyed. So not only was art looted, sold, and destroyed, but also art criticism was outlawed in occupied Europe. Artists were required to register themselves and hope that they would not be prevented from pursuing their creative endeavors. On the occasion of the so-called Day of German Art in 1937, Hitler bellowed that we will from now on lead an unrelenting war of purification, an unrelenting war of extermination against the elements which have displaced our art. To bring it back to Austria, the Anschluss in 1938 really exposes the nature of the Nazi cultural kleptocracy, which at that point was proceeding at pace. There were various dimensions of Nazi looting, none of which I can really give much justice to, but it was definitely motivated by greed amongst the high command. We have many anecdotes of Hitler, Göring, and Frank's extravagance in this regard. Often Hitler and Göring would find themselves in a tug of war over specific pieces of art. Hitler either wanted it for his personal collection or for his Führer Museum, which he planned for construction in Linz. This is a photograph of its plan. Or Göring, of course, had his beloved Karen Hall, his estate, which he filled with priceless works of art, such as Cranach and Holbein, as well as pieces by Van Gogh, Monet, Botticelli, and Rubens. And Göring famously used Rubens' magnificent Diana at the Hunt, this wonderful picture here, as a screen for his projector in his living room in Karen Hall. Hans Frank was not shy in exploiting his power as Governor General of occupied Europe. And to this end, he was determined to hold on to the loot that he had obtained. Indeed, when he was captured by American troops, he had in his possession Da Vinci's Lady with an Ermine. So looting and confiscation of property in the context of the Third Reich was not only about personal greed, but it was also a core economic pillar of Göring's four-year plan. Again, the Austrian context is interesting here. In this regard, immediately upon occupation, property was seized, including that belonging to the Rothschilds. Residents were required to register their personal belongings, thus creating a useful inventory of loot. The American Consul General in Vienna at the time remarked that there is a curious respect for legalistic formalities. The signature of the person despoiled is always obtained, even if the person in question has been sent to Dachau in order to break down his resistance. The individual, moreover, must go through an endless series of transactions in order to liquidate his property and possessions and proceed abroad penniless. He is not permitted to simplify matters by making everything over en bloc to the state. Now at Nuremberg, we had some semblance of accountability. We had a significant part of the evidential record relating to the destruction of cultural heritage. Particularly the Soviet prosecution team led quite a bit of evidence, such as relating to the looting of the Hermitage collection, the bombing of various monuments and sites throughout occupied Eastern Europe. Rosenberg was prosecuted successfully for his role in the looting of material. However, there has not been or there wasn't at the time, a dedicated case looking at crimes against culture, crimes against art, because we had various actors in the art world who were involved in this. We had artists themselves, we had dealers, we had historians who were all engaged in looting material or engaging in what Lynn Nicholas has referred to as the rape of Europa. And I've always wondered why under the Control Council there wasn't a dedicated case dealing with crimes against culture. So this led me, of course, then to look at, well, was the UNWCC doing it? So that's where I'll go now. So recently, the Allied response to the destruction and plunder of cultural property in occupied Europe has been romanticized and mythologized to a certain extent. And I'm referring here to a number of recent Hollywood films, but in particular one by the name of The Monuments Men. It has a wonderful cast. It's a terrible film. I wouldn't recommend you watch it, but it looked more or less at the work of the Monuments, Fine Arts and Archives program, the MFA&A. And the MFA&A was established in 1943 and fell under the authority of the Civil Affairs and Military Government sections of the Allied armies. Its primary purpose was safeguarding of cultural monuments and the identification and restitution of looted cultural objects in the context of newly liberated Europe. But this program sat alongside another one, which was set up by the US, and it was referred to as the American Commission for the Protection and Salvage of Artistic and Historic Monuments of War. It was established by FDR in 1943 and was chaired by Owen Roberts, who was a US Supreme Court judge, and it also sat on a commission that investigated the attack on Pearl Harbor. I was interested to see to what extent the MFA&A and the Roberts Commission interacted with the UNWCC. That's a lot of acronyms, but hopefully I'll keep you on board. I discovered immediately that there's no obvious link between the Roberts Commission and the UNWCC in terms of direct contact. However, there's plenty of evidence to suggest that the MFA&A were cooperating with the UNWCC and were indeed forwarding them quite a bit of information. For instance, if we look at this summary of information, 34, we see the level of cooperation. Now, this is just for illustrative purposes to divert your gaze. I don't expect you to read it. It's also proof that I've actually gone to the archive and had a look at it. But this particular document entitled Looted by High German Officials, we see that significant portions of the summary are derived from documents received from the Monuments and Fine Arts branch. Okay, we also see that much of the information in this document is derived from interrogation of suspects by the MFANA. And interrogation of suspects involved in the looting of cultural property was undertaken quite extensively in 1945 and 1946 by the US in the context of the Office of Strategic Services Art Looting Investigation Unit. There, when we go to the archive, we see quite detailed records of these interrogations of key players like Heinrich Hoffmann, Bruno Loos, and Walter Hoffer. These people played an invaluable role in the construction of the case against Rosenberg in the IMT. Returning to this particular document, though, we see that there is quite a bit of degree referring to specific individuals. And in particular, one is that of Professor Alexander Langsdorff. The report identified him as having played a prominent role in the looting of Italian works of art. It includes summaries of accounts given by Langsdorff to the effect that he should be considered to fall within the same bracket as Albert Speer, namely someone who tried to lessen as much as possible the harm that was likely to result from his conduct. Now, there was a real move by the UNWCC to see what could be done to prosecute Alexander Langsdorff. One particular individual who was a part of the MFANA and was engaged with the UNWCC squadron leader Cooper hoped that the War Crimes Commission would be able to prepare a case file against him. Moves were taken, but unfortunately, 4 months after they proceeded with the case against Langsdorff, excuse me, he died of a pulmonary embolism. Now, another body, that's the MFANA, another body which I want to talk about that engaged with the UNWCC on these issues was the Inter-Allied Commission on the Protection and Restitution of Cultural Material. It's known as the Voucher Commission, after its chairman, Professor Paul Voucher. He was a cultural attaché at the French Embassy in London, and the commission was established by the Conference of Allied Ministers of Education, so the precursor to UNESCO, in 1944. Its mandate was to collect from all available sources the fullest possible information as to the damage, destruction, and looting of monuments, works of art, and cultural material of all sorts in the occupied countries. They also set about compiling lists of potential suspects. So obviously these indexes, these lists were incredibly useful to UNWCC. So to what degree did they actually interact with it? Well, if you go to the archive of the UNWCC, you see, and of the Voucher Commission, you see that there were a series of meetings in 1945. We see from this document that in March 1945, the UNWCC welcomed a delegation from the Voucher Commission to discuss ways of cooperating. During this meeting, the Voucher Commission Secretary, C.P. Harvey, said that they were very keen to interact, whereas Hearst, the chairman of the UNWCC meeting at the time, suggested that the UNWCC was now inclined to widen the scope of its activities and was taking an increased interest in crimes against artistic property. So this list of potential suspects was going to be incredibly useful to the UNWCC. How did they use it? Well, they sent an individual in the form of Wing Commander Llewellyn Jones. And Wing Commander Llewellyn Jones's objective was to go through the 400 or so cases of persons who have been concerned in the removal of art in occupied territories and identify cases that could be submitted for prosecution. He did this over a period of about 4 to 6 weeks. And he came back and he had selected approximately 40, which he deemed to have prosecutorial potential. However, it's clear that beyond a list of names, there was little really that was contained in the Voucher Commission files in terms of evidence. We had a list of who may be the perpetrators. We had no list of what evidential basis was there to form a case against them. It was nonetheless useful for the UNWCC's purposes. And Lord Finlay, who was the chair of the UNWCC at the time, proposed that 4 cases from this list of 40 be prepared for submission to Committee 1 of the UNWCC for a decision to be made on whether or not they should be prosecuted or cases should be forwarded in the usual way. The Voucher Commission, meanwhile, was looking and following these developments with great enthusiasm, expecting there to be very immediate results from this cooperation. However, they were quickly disappointed because the UNWCC then sort of kept them in the dark. When the Voucher Commission asked for an update on what was the status of these cases, they were told, you know, we'll tell you when there's something to report. Unfortunately, in the archive, I've gone through as many of the records as is publicly available right now. The minutes of their meetings run cold in October 1945. So I'm missing 3 months or so of committee meetings. So we have no idea what happened to these 4 cases. But I think it's interesting that the UNWCC at least had the objective, the impetus, the desire to pursue cases involving the destruction and looting of cultural property. So I hope when I dig deeper into the archive that I will discover a response to what actually happened to these cases. Now, there are other, when we look beyond the Voucher Commission, there are other sources of information that we can find about the degree to which the UNWCC were engaged with it. One was a legal opinion which they proposed on relating to, what to do with individuals charged with looting in terms of what should the penalty be. And one opinion came from Marcel de Beer, who was one of the most foremost academics who was involved with advising Committee 3 on legal issues. And he proposed that any individual who was found to be in possession of looted material should be prosecuted and sentenced to death. He said, throughout liberated Europe, people should be given 8 weeks to declare what they had come by illegal means. And if it was subsequently discovered that they had failed to declare everything, they should be prosecuted and sentenced to death. It was a pretty extreme proposal, to say the least, and there was very forthright pushback from the committee who said this was not what we were brought here to determine. They said they weren't here to return looted objects or to create new crimes, but to punish war criminals instead. So to wrap up, and I'm skipping through, as you can imagine, quite a bit of what I had planned to say, the UNWCC did have a role to play. If we look at the reports of the war criminals that were published in 1949, we see several cases relating to the destruction of cultural monuments. We could look at, as well, at the trial of Otto Greiser before the Supreme Tribunal of Poland for cultural genocide, an incredibly important case that doesn't get the attention that it deserves. But this here is proof, if we needed it, that the UNWCC was interested in crimes against cultural property, that it did set about preparing case files, but what happened to those case files is the next step in my research. So thank you for your attention, and thank you, Miloš.